Hi, I'm Janice Perkins with Methods of Leaders, and I'm joined today by Bill Flynn, who has over 30 years business experience working for and advising hundreds of companies, including 20 plus startups, 10 operationally with 5 successful outcomes. He was a startup VP 8 times, a CMO, handled 2 IPOs and 7 acquisitions. He's been a business advisor and coach for over 10 years, a member of Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches, a certified 3-year highly achievable goal growth coach, holds a certification from the Foundations of Neuroleadership, the author of the book Further, Faster, and he's also one of the co-authors in Darcy Vernon's new book, The Freedom from Constraints. I can't believe I just tripped on that word. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today, Bill.
Morning, Janice. Glad to be
here.
here.
The other thing that wasn't added to your bio was that you're a word nerd.
I am a word nerd, yes.
Yes, a fellow word nerd. And although you do word puzzles a lot more than I do, I want you to start out by telling us about the new book, Freedom from Constraints.
Sure. So Darcy, who's in this group that you mentioned that Marshall Goldsmith started a number of years ago, is also a new member and always wanted to publish a book. So he reached out to us, a bunch of us, and said, hey, I'd like to do this, and I'd like to do it relatively quickly. So I'd like to leverage all of the assets that I have access to, which is sort of all these people and their experience. And I offered to do that as well. So I think there are 20 some odd chapters to this Freedom of Constraints. And the premise of the book is that the constraints are actually good for productivity. If we are given just free rein to do everything, often we as human beings don't accomplish anything. So it's good to have sort of that constraint model. And there is a woman in our group. Her name is Aisha Bursell, and she's a designer, and she's a huge fan of constraints. And she helped design the chair for, I think it's Herman Miller, which is a chair that most of us have sat in at least once if they've been in an office. And so she had to make this beautiful, comfortable chair. But she said it had to be made and be able to be sold for $500 or less. And that was a big constraint, but it helped her to really focus her time and energy. So that's what the book is about, is sort of gives you freedom. Once you sort of understand your barriers, then your ingenuity, your creativity, your innovation starts to flourish, because now you're given this premise that you have to work with, which is good for your brain, because our brain really likes constraints. It sort of wanders off if it doesn't have them.
It's a boundary issue, right?
Exactly.
So that takes us into your brain work. Talk to me about neuroleadership.
So neuroleadership is a term that I think David Rock coined 20 some odd years ago. He is the founder of the Neuroleadership Institute. The basic premise of neuroleadership is that you, as a leader, need to understand that it's really important to create a brain-friendly organization. And what I mean by brain-friendly is that you have to understand at least the basic premise of the brain and how it works, because it controls a lot more than we think it does, and has us act in certain ways that wasn't really designed to do what we're using it for. The last upgrade, according to what I've learned of our brain, our major upgrade was about 10 to 50,000 years ago. So our brain thinks it's on the savannah and in tribes. And one of the issues it has, it doesn't understand the difference between a social threat and a physical threat. The same areas of the brain light up generally when you have a social threat, meaning you're put in the out group, or something isn't fair, or your autonomy is taken away, or something like that. That is seen as a social threat. And I've actually experienced this to a tremendous degree. When I was first becoming a coach, I had to go through a certification program. And at the beginning of the certification program, you have to go to a 2-day class. So I was flown into Phoenix, Arizona, and I had never been a coach before. I didn't really know what I was doing. But at the end of the class, you're supposed to give a 5-minute presentation based on some slides that they gave you. So that was fine. Now, the class was for newbies, generally. So all of us were supposed to be new coaches or new to the organization. but my class wasn't. There were only 3 of us that were newbies. Everyone else had been a coach in the organization for a number of years, or been a coach for dozens of years, or worked for the company. So that was a little intimidating, because now I was giving this presentation to people who already knew what I was talking about and weren't new. But what happened was, when I went to go give my presentation, the slides that I was given to practice with, which I practiced over and over and over and basically had them memorized, were not the same, nor were they in the same order that I was given them. And I freaked out. I started sweating. I could feel the sweat run down the inside of my body, or my armpits down, big, huge things that felt like. My vision actually became tunnel. I lost my peripheral vision. And I couldn't really hear what I was saying. I knew I was talking, but I wasn't really hearing it. It was a very odd feeling. And because my brain was saying, get out of there, run. My heart was beating, etc. So we do that as leaders inadvertently all the time. We put people into threat mode without even knowing that we're doing it. And that's with feedback, that's with growth, that's with all sorts of things that we do. And there's a model that Mr. Rock has, which is called the SCARF model, which he says basically our brain wants to move towards reward and away from threat. And we as leaders can help them do that by thinking about these 5 things, which is the SCARF model, which stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Status is pretty straightforward. Certainty is really helping people understand, what are we doing? What is your role? How do we know when it's successful, etc. Autonomy is giving people the ability to make mistakes and to think on their own and to do their job as they wish. Relatedness is pretty simple. It's, are you in the in group or are you in the out group? Right? We've had this since we were in high school. And then fairness. I joke that we have a fairness gene as human beings. We will do things that are not in our best interest because we think it is unfair. And there's a really cool game called I think it's called the Dilemma game, where people are given $10, and there are 2 people, they don't know each other, they're in different rooms, they can't see each other, and the person with the $10 can give the other person as much or as little money as they want. And very often, I think 60 or 70% of the time, if the person is given $3 or less, they reject the offer. That's actually called the ultimatum game. And if they reject the offer, then neither party gets any money, which, as you can imagine, is irrational, because they didn't have the $3 to start. It was free money, but because it didn't feel fair, they rejected it. So that's another example of sort of how we're a bit of an irrational species in many ways. So that's what it means to have neuroleadership, is to really create this brain-friendly organization.
So it really is relative to psychological safety from the perspective of the employee, is what you're talking about. And it's understanding why people don't feel safe in an organization from that framework as a leader. Exactly.
Yeah. Amy Edmondson and David Rock are very close related there. She has been to the Neuroleadership Institute, to the summits. They do some work together. So yes, it's very, very connected.
So what would you say that a couple of the steps that a leader could take in light of the past couple of years where there is a growing anxiety and uncertainty? How can what you're talking about help a leader create more psychological safety in the wake of more crisis?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that have come out which can help people. One is that you should understand that everyone is reacting to a crisis in a different way. And it's affecting them in different ways. So you really have to be sensitive to that. You can't just sort of treat everyone the same, either because it's directly affecting them or indirectly affecting them, or just it has a psychological effect on them that they just react to things differently. So the first thing you have to do is understand sort of where are the people on your team. And the Neuroleadership Institute has this sort of red, yellow, green model where green is sort of our normal state. Life is not a given. I'm a Stoic. I study Stoicism, and there's a thing in Stoicism called memento mori, which basically says, remember, at any point in time, you could die. We are not guaranteed to live a certain number of years. It's just the way it is. And that applies as well, is that, that's sort of our normal state, is that we know that life is uncertain, but we've sort of dealt with it. And so that's green. So you should understand who the people are in green. Yellow is that the crisis is understandable and it's nearby. It's sort of in the neighborhood, but it's not directly affecting us. So they're more cautious than they would normally be. But they can probably function relatively well. And then there's red, of course, in terms of COVID. Either you have COVID, someone in your family has COVID that's really close to you, or is in the hospital, or has passed away from COVID. So that would mean they're red. They're all going to react very differently to certain things in the organization. So you have to sort of understand that. And then the next thing is to give them some level of control. One of the things that when we're in crisis is we want to try to control things. And we do things in certain ways. There have been lots of things about masks and vaccines and that kind of stuff. And I think that's part of it, is that people just want to feel like they have control over something. So they've decided that it should be this thing, be it I'm not wearing a mask because I want to control my freedom, or whatever whatever they come up with, or a vaccine thing because it's not tested yet, the FDA hasn't said it's tested, and all that kind of thing. So I'm controlling that. So I think part of that is what we're doing. So as a leader, give them control, give them something that they enjoy, that has meaning, that ties to the company and to their own well-being. That can at least give them something that at least for part of the day, they can have some control over. And that will go a long way to that. And then the last thing is just check in a lot more often. Just ask people how they're doing, share your own vulnerability so they can feel like they can be vulnerable as well, and share maybe what's going on. Sometimes just understanding that you're not in this alone can be helpful. So those are some of the things that I've come across that can be helpful to leaders.
So I was just going to say, death in armpits, Bill. This is riveting. We're taking this a different direction than I expected. I'm just kidding. So what I want you to touch on that you did at the very beginning, when you talked about the tribalism and the way that our brain is relative to the tribal behavior. So how does that affect a culture and what a leader should be looking at in the terms of the way employees are behaving?
Yeah, so there's this number, it's called the Dunning number, I think, and it's 150. And they say that basically our ancestors gathered in groups of 150 or less, because if 150 was about the number that you didn't really have a close relationship with everyone, but you understood everyone, you had a sort of a general sense of who people were, what they were doing, etc. And obviously there were varying degrees of closeness and intimacy with people there. And there are companies out there that as soon as they get to 150, they basically break the company into another entity and sort of separate them and keep this sort of 150 number going. So that's one thing. The second is that we have evolved to our sort of primacy in the shrub of life, if you will, because of our ability to work together and our imagination. So, I mean, there are lots of animals that work together. Hyenas work together, and lions and lionesses work together, etc. But they work on instinct, where we have this. Supposedly, we have this extra thing, which is we can think about thinking. We can think of things that haven't happened yet. We can think of how other people are thinking, this sort of theory of mind, etc. And that helps us to understand how to be good as a tribe, because we can then say, okay, my job is to go out and get the meat. This person's job is to just tend to the fire. This person's job is to make sure that we have vegetables, etc. These people take care of the children, and we all sort of have these roles, but they're interrelated. And the accumulation of those that understanding allows us to now then create more free time. Eventually got us to be farmers, which we did whatever it was thousands of years ago, which then accelerated us as a species once we could farm. I think it accelerated us and also had some deleterious effects as well. So that's sort of like the world we're living in as beings. There's this guy Jonathan Haidt, and I love his take on this. Is he says that we are 90% chimp and 10% bee. So we're mostly selfish. we're mostly looking out for ourselves, but we also understand that we're part of a larger collective. And there's this great meme that I think you and I have talked about before, which is a classroom that has a bunch of students in it, and they're all sort of, it looks like they're at a lecture. And we have this dichotomous tension, which is we want to feel like we're unique, but we also want to belong, right? And this sort of this chimp bee thing, right? And this meme, I think, really expresses it well. So all of the students, and the whole thing is there's probably 50, 60, 80 students, whatever it is, and they all have Apple Macs. And they also have that silver screen, and you can see the apple. And at the bottom of the meme, it says, "Be different." Now, so everyone has a Mac, yet it's saying to be unique. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to be unique within a tribe. So this is tattoos, this is emo, this is punk. Pick your sort of cohort of unusual things, and that allows us to feel like we are different, but we're still part of something else. And if we can do that, if we can manage that tension, we're much happier as human beings.
So I love that you just said the word tension, because that's a word I just wrote down. There's like a tension and an acceptance of both of those things. And you also used the word supposedly at one point when you were talking about that. Supposedly, this is how we behave as people in a sense of belonging. But what happens in that tribal behavior when there's toxicity, when there's drama? What happens in our tribal brains?
Yeah. So there's something called the tragedy of the commons, I believe, and I think that's sort of what you're describing, is that unfortunately sometimes this selfish part of us overrides, because it is the largest part of us. And the tragedy of the commons is basically a metaphor that says if you have a shared space that everyone's using to grow crops or whatever, that people will do their best to take more and more of the space. And if you do that, then other people get shut out, and then they start to take some of your space. So then it becomes this horrible situation. So you have to really balance that and manage that tension between the two, and understand that sometimes you have to give up some of yourself and some of your selfish needs in order for everyone to do well, because it actually helps you in the long run, right? We've all read this story about the stone soup. Right, the village that basically it was I think they had like a drought or some sort of blight or something, and there was no food, and so everyone pitched in and they made soup so everyone could be nourished, which means that they could get through this, and then the village could flourish after. So obviously, if people perished, then they would be much smaller, and that would bring peril to the village. That's the same thing. It's this interesting tension. And what happens is when we get more and more into crisis, we forget that we're part of a larger thing, and we just try to protect ourselves. And again, that's our brain working against us, saying, survive, right? Get the calories you need, get the energy you need, take from others so you can survive. And that will work for a little while, but if you do that over the long term, there are plenty of examples over the history of man where these civilizations don't exist anymore, and if we do some research, it's because they either did it to themselves as people, or they did it to the land. They just like Easter Island and these places where these people who used to thrive there are no longer live there. They actually don't exist anymore. So I think like Aztecs and the Incas are probably in that range as well. So it's something we have to be careful. And I won't there's other examples, with climate and all that kind of stuff. We won't get into that.
Well, I want to pivot into your startup experience, and I want you to tell me, why do most businesses fail?
Yeah, sure. So that's, you're asking, I think, two different questions, because a startup is not a regular business. I've come to believe in this gentleman's name is Steve Blank. He's called the godfather of startups. He's done 8 startups. He's now a professor at UC Berkeley. He's written a bunch of books, which I highly recommend you do not read. He writes like a professor, and the books are really dense and hard to read, but he's a great speaker. So go on YouTube and watch him there. And his definition is a startup is a temporary organization in search of a business model. So startups fail for different reasons than scale-ups. So startups fail because of what I've come to know as founderitis, which is basically you fall in love with your idea. And then you try to convince everyone how great your idea is. And I tell leaders this all the time, is people don't care about your idea. They don't care about what you do. They care what you do does for them. So what you should do is you need to fall in love with the problem for the customer that you believe it's going to help. And then if you do that, you have at least a fighting chance of making it into a real business. It's not a guarantee. You'll also spend a lot less time and a lot less money trying to figure it out. So that's a startup. The other thing I tell them is don't run out of money, because startups, that's the big thing. It's just don't run out of money. You only have to worry about two things. All this thing about culture and values and purpose and all that, I'm like, don't even worry about it. It will evolve eventually. Let's just get this thing started first. So that's sort of that's typically the main reason why startups fail. In terms of scale ups or businesses that get through the knothole, I wish there was one answer. But so about 4 years ago, I asked myself the question, why do startups fail? And I got all these answers, and I just got into Google. I asked people, and I just started writing them all down. I think I got to about 35 different reasons. And I just stopped because there were just more. So there are tons of ways to go out of business. If I had to pick one, I think the one that to me explains it the most is most businesses die or struggle through indigestion, not through starvation. They try to do too many things, too much of them, too often. And they spread themselves too thin. And of course, as we've noticed, every 6 to 8 years, some economic crisis hits us. Either it's self-inflicted or it's from external, right? We're 21 years into this century. We've had 9/11, we've had 2008, and we've had COVID. That's 7 years on average, right? It pretty much happened. If you go back to the 2000s, the 90s, the 80s, and 70s, every 6 to 8 years, something bad happens. And if you spread yourself too thin, you generally have to invest widely, and you don't have enough cash to survive. And that's what happens, is sort of the weak of the herd, if you will, get taken out because they're not ready for this. So that's super important as well. Again, back to the cash thing, right? Don't run out of cash. Have enough cash in the bank to survive. COVID is so unusual. It's lasted so long and affected in so many different ways. It's kind of an anomaly, but it still fits in the spectrum. It's just way on one side.
So what you said was really interesting as far as the cash is concerned, because what I wanted to ask you is what should a company focus on not to do versus what to do? So on the not to do list is don't run out of cash, right? Why is that perspective different?
Of running out of cash?
No, of focusing on what not to do versus what to do.
So if you're going to win, quote unquote, win in the marketplace, meaning that you have a solid strategy that differentiates you, that allows your best customer to identify you as really the only choice for them. And this guy Pareto was pretty much a genius, right? He's the 80-20 guy. And if you apply the Pareto principle, which you should, to business, your best customers are 16 times on average more valuable than every other customer you have. They drive more profit. They give you more referrals. They're happy to be a reference. There is so many much more value that they give to you. Yet we as a business chase revenue more than we chase cash. So if you have a good strategy, then a strategy is about choice, but it's about choosing much more often what not to do than what to do. There's a great quote by I think his name is Antoine Saint-Exupéry, which is this wonderful French guy. He wrote The Little Prince. And his quote is I think related to strategy, because strategy is a design model, right? You're designing your strategy, craft your strategy. And this quote from Saint-Exupéry was about design, which it says, perfection is not achieved when there's more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And that's what you should do with a strategy. The best businesses have super simple strategies. There is a company in Japan, and just outside of Kyoto, and they make mochi. And they have made mochi for 1,000 years. They are still in business, and they started 1,000 years ago. Southwest has a super simple business model. They are the most profitable airline and have been for 50 years. Apple, although it's big, is basically, their premise is, we only make things that are simply amazing and amazingly simple. They just apply that to a computer or a phone or a watch. So if you can simplify what your business is, you're much more likely to be able to help identify the right customer, because we as human beings, we have it's called the paradox of choice. We think we like choice. We hate choice. It actually stifles our ability to make a decision. So if you can make it really simple and say, well, that's the only choice, we actually like that better. We will make a decision better. There's been great studies in grocery stores where, I think it was like jellies. And one day they went in with 24 different versions of the jelly. And the volume of people who came by the table was massive, right? And it was super busy, etc. And then they came in a week later and they only had 6 choices. And the volume was different. But when they went and checked the receipts of people who purchased, the people who purchased on the day that they were 6 was, I think, 3 or 4 times the amount of people who purchased when they were 24. We were stymied by the choice. So we just decided to forget it. And we do that all the time. If we get overwhelmed, we just stop. We don't do anything. That's not an unusual behavior for human beings.
Well, I want you to expand on that, because what I want you to talk about in relationship to what you're talking about in a complexity of strategy is then the difficulty of execution or implementation.
Yeah. So again, if you don't have a clear and crisp strategy, then, because strategy and execution are not 2 different things, they're the 2 sides of the same coin. I talk to leaders. I used to be a Vistage speaker, so I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of leaders. And these company sizes are tens of millions to hundreds of millions, and there were a few billion-dollar companies in the room. And one of the things that I asked them is, what is your biggest barrier to growth? And I would have them write it on a sticky, and then they bring it up, and we sort of put it up on the board and organize them in a certain way. And most of them are operational reasons, so execution issues, right? I can't hire fast enough. We're not doing the right things. We're not doing them on time. We're missing deadlines, all these things. So those are execution issues. And then so I say, okay, and I sort of put them in that. And I say, okay, so what are you executing on, is what I ask them. And often when I do this, either one-on-one or in a group, there's a pause. And they think about it. And very often the first answer out is, oh, I'm executing on the plan, the strategic plan. Of course, they call it, because it's always better when you put the word strategic in front of something. It makes it more important. And I say, okay, how did you come up with that? I'm trying to get them to, it's a strategy. We're executing on our strategy. And I say, okay, so if we believe that we're executing on a strategy, and I come into your office at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, and I ask your leaders that report into you, if they could all write down in their own words, what is our company strategy currently? And I would have them read that out loud. I say, so what do you think would happen? And I often get a smile or a laugh, and they say, oh, they'd be all over the place. I said, yeah, so if we're executing on our strategy, I said, maybe they're actually not executing badly. They're executing really well, but it's on their version of the strategy. Mm-hmm. So that's your job, to get them all on the same page. Make it a simple page, make it truly easy to understand and remember. So there are 2 strategies that I talk about there are actually 3. There's mine, but there are 2 that most people know. So Southwest's strategy is wheels up. And supposedly, if you go on the tarmac and talk to one of the guys who's the baggage handler, et cetera, and you ask him or her, what is Southwest strategy? They will know that it is wheels up. Everyone knows what it is. And that basically says, when we have planes in the air, we make money. Our job as a collective group is to figure out ways and to work so the planes are always in the air, because that's when we make money. The other one is IKEA, which is flat packed furniture. They found that one of the constraints and one of the things that was holding back the furniture industry was air. There's lots of air in furniture. So when you ship it, I'm sure you've moved, etc. And if you look in the U-Haul, it looks busy, it looks full, but there's a lot of air in there, right? There's air under the couch, between the couches, on the chairs, etc. So they said, how do we get rid of the air? And they said, well, let's just put it in a box. So how do we create furniture that you can put in a box and there's no air? So either the people can come get it themselves, or we can ship it. We can ship more. We can do more things, etc. So that was their strategy. And that's how they had the meatballs and the other cool things as well. But that was their main thing. So that's mostly about choosing what not to do, right? Southwest puts you through a lot of crap. You have to stand in the cattle line. You have the ABC thing. You can't pick your seat. There's no real food. There's a box of salt and sugar that they give to you, and you get to pick your package, etc. But you'll put up with that because their strategy to us is low fares, lots of flights, lots of fun. And they've been doing that for 50 years. And I think they're the third largest airline in the entire world, and they only serve North America, which is insane.
Mm-hmm. So I want you to tell me what inspired you to be a leader.
So I've always sort of been Socratic in my approach. So Socrates was someone who asked lots of questions. And for some reason, people followed me. They like that because I wasn't much about. Shouldn't say that. When I first was a leader, like I was in my teens and 20s, I was working at Papagino's at a pizza place, and I was in the manager. I was kind of a jerk. I told people what to do. I was hard on them, etc. And then I sort of said, I don't know that I would want to be treated that way. So I started to change my style. And when I worked in high tech, and when I finally became a leader, a director of people, etc., I tried to make it about them. I tried to make their lives better. I tried to find out what they loved to do, what they were good at, and try to have them do that as often as possible. And that's a really good feeling, right? And the story I like to tell is sort of how I became a coach is also, I think, a leadership story, is between startups 5 and 6. So I did 10 startups over 25 years. I can't remember if you said how many I did. So I did 10 startups. Between 5 and 6, I had a horrible situation where I took over as the GM. January 2nd, 2009 was the best and the worst day of my life. This email hosting company that I was, my professional life, this email hosting company that I was now taking over wasn't delivering email to anyone on that first day, the second day, and halfway through the third day. And when people don't get email, they're really, really unhappy. Email is like air, right? You just expect it to be there. So when it's not there, it's a problem. We lost 1,000 customers in a week, and I had to go around saving lots of other customers. And I was put in a situation where I couldn't fix it on my own. Luckily, the company that bought us had enough money and they could fix the infrastructure, and they were doing that. But we also had these customers. I had 60 people working for me. In the organization, we had to do something. So I had 4 or 5 of us in the group that led this. 2 of them really hadn't led anyone before. They were good technicians. And I said, look, I'm a sales and marketing guy. I don't know what a technical infrastructure looks like. This was before AWS. We had to actually rent data center. We had to run it ourselves, etc. I'd never run finance before. I'd never run tech support before. So I don't know. I can't give you any answers. But what I can do is I can give you direction. I can say, let's discuss, debate, and decide what we want this thing to look like when we're out of it. And then we did that. And I said, great. Now that we've described that and we wrote it down, I said, each of you now needs to create your roadmap from where you are today in your group and where you want to be, how to contribute to getting us to that ideal state that we talked about. And then we just worked together on a regular basis every day. We helped each other. And it worked phenomenally because they had autonomy. They knew what we were doing. We were supporting each other. It was a team effort. And that really cemented for me what a leader is. And it was more, now I wanted to teach other people how to do that. But I tucked that away. I did 4 more startups over the next 5 or 6 years, which none of them went really well. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to be a coach and to teach other people what I have learned about being a leader, which to me, the best leader I have ever come across, and I've been talking about this guy for years and years, even before I was in this group with Marshall, who he's part of, is this guy, Alan Mulally. Alan Mulally is the best leader who nobody knows. He's better than Steve Jobs, better than Herb Keller at Southwest, better than Sam Walton, better than, name your leader that everyone knows. Why? Because he fixed 2 companies in the middle of economic existential crises for the particular industry they were in. When he was at Boeing, he went through 9/11. And then when he was at Ford, it went through 2008. He had them coming out better than they went in. Actually, in 2015, in Ford became the #1 car company in the world again for the first time since Henry Ford ran it. Which was 80 or 90 years ago. And it was a year after. It was sort of his legacy that got them there. And so not only did he do that, so he's an excellent operator and manager, but he is one of the nicest human beings you'll ever meet. And the reason I know this is because I am now friends with Alan Mulally because he reached out to me and said he wanted to meet me. And that's one of the reasons I'm in Marshall's group. So, I think more people need to know folks like Alan Mulally or Kip Tyndall of Container Store or John Mackey from Whole Foods or, pick your conscious capitalism leader. Those businesses will endure, but you have to be patient because you have to do it. I love what Alan says is, I was like, Alan, how did you make this happen? He says, you got to love them up, but hold them to the standard. He says, and if they don't want to meet the standard, then you compassionately exit them from the company because that's what we've decided is who we are. So that's sort of a quarter answer to a nickel question of sort of my leadership journey and why I liked being one and I liked now helping leaders.
No, I love that story. And what I want you to, as I work us to a close here, because Methods of Leaders is really near and dear to my heart. And I want you to describe for me what that as a tool in an organization can really help a leader with, coming from all these thought leaders across the globe that people don't know who they are, like an Alan Mulally, and even people who don't even know who Marshall Goldsmith is. Talk to me about what that means to learn from people like that and how that could add value to an organization.
Yeah, so the best ideas are typically built on something else, and that's what you can do with others. That's why I think we like these stories from other people, other leaders, and really understanding who the best leaders are. There are a lot of leaders out there that have a megaphone and tell you, here's how I did it. And the sort of subtext is, so if you just do what I did, you'll be successful too. And I got to tell you, most of the time that doesn't work because very often that human being is the X factor. And they have what's called the curse of knowledge. They don't know that what they are doing is so unique and they haven't described it in such a way that other people can learn from it. So what I like about working with the folks at Methods is, we really break it down to, sort of its fundamental parts so we can explain to people, even there are things that I do that, that people will say, well, how did, they'll ask me, well, how did that work? And how did you do that? And I'll say, oh, well, that's how I got there. And for me, it was just, I do this, I wave my hands, I do this, and it happens, sort of this magic, it's called the TAMO model. Then a miracle occurs, et cetera, and something happens. But there's something in the miracle. And so online learning, those kinds of things are great because our brain doesn't learn the way we were taught. I don't know what your education was. We were generally the same age. You just look way better than I do. And, sitting in a classroom, having some person pour stuff into you that you then repeat back to them 2 weeks later and then forget almost all of it a week later, that's not learning. That's knowing how to take a test. Learning is about absorbing and retaining and being able to recall and use in different ways. So what I love about online courses, like what Methods is doing, is that you can go back and revisit it. Repetition is a huge factor in learning, right? Because, so I'll geek out on you a little bit, is so when we get new information, it goes into the hippocampus. And the hippocampus job is to figure out what am I supposed to do with this, right? And if it's a short-term thing, then it will keep it for 7 seconds, 10 seconds, something like that. And if it doesn't need it, it throws it away. If it seems like there's something here, then it stores it somewhere else. And it'll store it there. And the more it is accessed, and the more it's accessed in different ways, the more the brain says, oh, this must be important. I should probably remember this. That's why I'm sure you can remember a song from when you were 12 years old, and you can still remember the words today, because then it was super important to you, and you listened to it over and over again, and you sang it, and etc. That's how learning works, right? Learning works, something that grabs our attention, something that we can generate information from, and we can tie it to lots of different things. You can probably tie that song to maybe someone you were dating or some high school thing that happened or whatever. There's lots of stuff that you can tie to, which your brain says, oh, this is important. And it was important to you. It was emotional. It was probably fun, or maybe it was sad, and you remember it that way. And then what I love about as well is spacing is the last thing. And with online stuff, you can keep revisiting it. Like training that you sit there in front of someone is fine, but it's over in 2 days, and then you never revisit it again, and you probably forget. That's why most training doesn't work. But with stuff like Methods, you can go back and just repeat it. And maybe quiz yourself and then go play it back and say, how much did I remember of that? And that's another, self-quizzing is another way to do it. So I think that's one of the reasons I really wanted to take my stuff with Further Faster, because it's It's a bit of a thick book. It's a little dense. There's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, there's exercise and stuff, but this is another medium because the exercises are text, where this will be visual. And so I'm going to give people lots of different ways, because some people like to learn visually, some people like to learn by reading, some people like to learn by listening, etc. So that's the mode that I'm in relative to working with you guys.
Well, I'm really glad. I was in a conversation once with a group of people, and someone said that's the hippopotamus part of the brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad we got to that part of the brain in the conversation. Bill, will you tell everyone before we close how they can find you?
Sure. So mostly I can be found on Catalyst Growth Advisors. That's probably the best place to find me. I'm also on LinkedIn a little bit. I do post almost every day something, hopefully of use. But my phone number's on there. You can actually book a meeting with me. You can see all of my offerings. I write a blog post twice a month, and those are up there. There's like 130 or 140 of them now. You can actually download my book for free if you want from my site. You can go to Amazon or Audible and download it there, and I get $4 or $5, so that's cool too. But I'm more about the message than the money, so I offer it to anyone who wants it for free.
That's awesome. I really thank you, Bill, for joining us today. Bill Flynn from Catalyst Growth Advisors. I'm Janice Perkins with Methods of Leaders, and you can find us at methodsof.com. Thank you for joining us today.